a bit worried about you liking Article 50, because I had several arguments when I was in UKIP for 19 years against Patrick O'Flynn that we could get out in an afternoon if we repeal the European Communities Act, and that to put the blame where it is. Not many people know that they can pass guillotine measures and get various things like on terrorism. They can pass that in an afternoon. Their own syndicate they can pass in an afternoon, but they can't get the future of our country in.
Can I? Yeah. You're starting to be long and rambling.
Yeah. Okay. I wondered why you haven't used the OECD City AM article that 80% of the world's export will be out of Europe by 2024. So that is quite close for me. Obviously, I want to be out tomorrow, but
yes,
I want.
Well, I think just to answer that briefly, and I'm sure the other members of the panel say that, but as I've opened my mouth on the topic, I think Article 50 is by far the best means out, because it does give us the time to actually do a deal. If you just pull the statute, then you're left there with everything crashing around your ears, aren't you? You don't have that 2-year gap to try and do a deal without there being panic in the markets. You would have unutterable panic in the markets if you just pulled the statute. And you wouldn't have a chance to really settle down and agree things which have to be agreed. But anyway, I'll hand over to John for a second.
Yes, I'll just say this. I think a lot of these issues are actually very complex, and one of our problems is to try and get any sort of agreement as to where to go ahead. I mean, if I can just say one or two comments on what Robert Oles has said. I mean, I think there are attractions about the EFTA option, but there are also significant disadvantages. One is that there's no guarantee that EFTA would actually have us back in. No. And one of the uncertainties that would certainly be exploited by our opposition would be concerns about whether we would be readmitted, whether this actually would be practical. And also, if we do go into EFTA, and especially if we go into the EEA, we're then left with, okay, not quite the same obligations on free movement of labour, but pretty well the same ones as we've got already, plus all the requirements of the single market, which is another issue which a lot of other people are very concerned about. I mean, I think there is an argument, at least worth considering, that the best solution is the WTO one, which you actually didn't mention, which is we come out of the European Union altogether and then negotiate from that position, because at least that step doesn't involve anybody else agreeing to anything. This is something that we could do unilaterally, so there's at least a fair measure of certainty about it. Also, the other thing you didn't mention, Robert, is what you do about the customs union as against a free trade area. I mean, there are all sorts of complicated pros and cons about all this. And what I would really finish up by saying is that, you know, I do think it's really worthwhile concentrating hard on trying to get some agreement about what we all think is the best way ahead, taking into account all the advantages which Robert set out, but also some of the difficulties, to try and get some clarity about what we're offering the British people if we do come out. And then I think that'll bear then, again, whether we go for the European Communities Act or whether the Article 50 route. I think actually, from what I've heard, the answer is to go for both in some sort of staged process. But unravelling it all is going to be very complicated. It's not going to be an easy step by any stretch of the imagination.
I think Robert would like to come back.
Yeah, certainly. Just on the point of Article 50, just to deal with that first, that is the way out of the EU. It's the only way that we can force the EU to the negotiating table. And of course, it doesn't actually need an Act of Parliament, which could be very difficult to achieve, to take the Article 50 route. Really, at the moment, there is not a majority, neither in the House of Commons nor the House of Lords, to vote to repeal the 1972 European Communities Act, let alone all the impracticalities that would create. But there isn't a majority of parliamentarians that would vote for it, so that's not an option. The Article 50 route can be done by just a simple notice from the government, using the royal prerogative, the right to conduct diplomacy. It's very easy for us to issue that Article 50 notification. And what's really interesting is that there's no way of cancelling an Article 50 notification. You can extend the period of negotiations. It's currently set at 2 years, but that can be extended. But that requires unanimity to extend a negotiating period. Now, what could happen is that Britain could issue an Article 50 notification saying we want to come out. We may then, or the government may actually then change its minds. And it's less the 2-year period of negotiations is extended, that would apply. Britain would be out after 2 years, and it could any extension of the 2-year period could be vetoed by another country. That could be Estonia or perhaps or probably France, and we'd be out even if we no longer wanted to be out. Article 50 is the best way out because it really does confirm that we're coming out of the European Union, and it's the only way to force them to the negotiating table. Regarding the issue of just John mentioned about, just to come back on John points, John Mills mentioned about rejoining EFTA, and there's no guarantee. Well, my colleague Hugo van Randwyk has had discussions with EFTA. They would actually welcome us back in as long as that Britain would be retaining the membership of the European Economic Area, because they want Britain's support in the discussions with Brussels. I did cover the customs union. That's not really an option. If we're in the customs union of the European Union, because the EU is many things, it is also a customs union having a common tariff, that would mean that we can't make our own trade agreements with other countries unless the EU has agreed that we can. Turkey is in the EU's customs union along with other countries such as San Marino and Andorra. Turkey finds it completely unacceptable. They find it humiliating that other countries then via the EU have free trade with Turkey, but Turkey cannot have its exports to other countries, third countries outside the EU, agreed. They don't like the agreement. It's actually very negative for the Turkish economy, and they also have to accept EU standards in industrial goods, which they don't like. So they're being pushed around. They find it unacceptable. The WTO option is not really an option because it doesn't deal with the access to the EU services market, nor its procurement market. It doesn't deal with rules of origin issues. It doesn't deal with designated ports of origin issues. It doesn't deal with the 10% tariffs on cars. It doesn't deal with the 12.8% tariffs on meslin products, a major export from Britain to other EU countries. It is suboptimal. People will not vote for it. There's uncertainty. Also, Britain's position, our trade policy with the WTO, doesn't actually exist. We need to reapply to the WTO to have our own trade policy back, because the trade schedules that Britain had before joining the EU have now since expired. So there's a whole host of problems with the WTO option. It is not a feasible option. And if we just leave without an agreement, that has many problems, because ideally we would want a trade agreement with the EU where there wouldn't be tariffs, where we could deal with all the issues about technical barriers to trade, about mutual recognition of goods, so much to be decided. Remember, we've been in the EU for more than 40 years, and there's a whole host of agreements that need to be reworked. If we left the EU, it would take a long time to get them back, unless, of course, we have an EFTA-EEA agreement, because with the European Union, even if they're going to have negotiations with another country to have a trade agreement, it takes a year for those discussions to actually begin, because the European Commission seeks to get an agreement from the European Parliament and the Council of Ministers on what the terms of that trade agreement should be. And that whole process to agree a discussions in principle takes a year to get underway, and that's before the discussions have even begun. So really, there's no example of the EU ever agreeing a trade agreement in less than 5 years. Often it's 10 years. We don't want to be presenting to the British public in a referendum that there could be the situation where there would be uncertainty. They won't vote for it. It's as simple as that. The British public, if they will not vote for uncertainty. That's why we need to have our bases covered, and we need to be sure that trade will continue the day after we leave the EU. And the only way to guarantee that, to have it down in the letter of the law, is the EFTA-EEA alternative.
You mentioned about Article 50. Please do take home this wallet of papers with you, which has the article there, a couple of pages of information on the international law, and an article I wrote about a year ago for Freedom Today, that's the Freedom Association magazine, on how to negotiate independence through this. Now, there are people who are concerned that, putting it mildly, EU might try to use the 2 years negotiating period to somehow do the dirty. And I make the suggestion for a constitutional backstop here on that. I don't think it's very likely, frankly, but it is possible to do that. But do take this home with you. It's got 2 pages of quite very useful information on the international law and actually the article itself, which for an EU document is remarkably short and straightforward.
Could I just ask one question, actually, of you, Robert, arising out of what you said? You said that EFTA had said that we could come in on certain basis. What sort of level was that at? I mean, who gave that offer?
Well, that was Hugo van Randwyk discussing with the EFTA Secretariat, which is based in Brussels. Also, Richard North has also had similar discussions as well. But EFTA, the Bruges Group's EFTA man is Hugo van Randwyk, who spoke at a meeting of the CIB here back,
some years ago,
I think in 2007,
if
I remember rightly.
I was very interested in what Robert had to say about specialised UN agencies actually above the European Union making the rules, which are then handed down to the EU, which acts as a sort of clearinghouse and farms them out to its member states. May I give you an actual example of that happening with regard to Norway, very briefly? If you look at the Codex Alimentarius committees, which deal with food and food processing, everything to do with food and food processing worldwide. If you look, there's 138 odd countries are members of those committees, plus one organization, which is the EU. Now, if you look down to the Fisheries Committee, you will find that it's hosted and chaired by Norway, which means that Norway is at the very center of all the rules worldwide made on fisheries and fishing. And that, in turn, protects its own enormous fishing industry. Now, if we were not a member of the EU, but were in the EEA EFTA, we could be a member of those committees like Norway, instead of having the rules handed down to us by the EU, which simply tries to represent its own agenda. That is a simple example.
That is an excellent example, and Norway has also used the International Maritime Organisation, which is based in London, to lobby for rules which have then applied to EU shipping rules. So that's an example of Norway using these international bodies, which are in many senses far more important than the EU, to get their agenda across. And of course, at the moment in the EU, we don't have really very much influence in these bodies because of we have to be subservient to what the European Commission wants. But if we're outside, we'll be fully engaged. We'd be at the real top table. The EU is not the top table. It's just, as you described, a clearinghouse.
I think just following on from the points made previously, I mean, when we're in the EU at the moment, we have around 8 to 10% of the vote. So on all the rules and regulations, we have 8 to 10% of the vote of the EU Trade Commissioner or any EU Commissioner who's negotiating on these global bodies. Instead of actually having 8 to 10% of the vote, you better actually go into the global body, having 100% of your own vote, the exact
one vote, which is the same as the EU's vote, one vote, same as Switzerland and Canada, etc. So we're not losing anything by moving to the EEA, we're gaining a greater voting share by going to the global body. Just on the immigration issue.
Get him to answer that point.
Sorry, it was just a point, right?
No, let him answer that.
Okay, that's a brilliant point. And of course, these global bodies, they require unanimity. So if there's something we don't like, then we could stop it at the global level. And really, even if we didn't and we changed our minds later, there isn't an enforcement mechanism. Of course, usually we would want to follow global rules because they are about eliminating technical barriers to trade and enhancing those economic links between countries. But yeah, you are absolutely right. Just one point, just to pick you up on, sorry, is that the current British influence in the EU is about 12.7%, but it can request to vote under the previous procedure, which is around the 10% mark. But yeah.
The point I was going to make is on the immigration issue. Actually, about 25% of the EU, the immigration arises not from the EU but from the European Court of Human Rights. So actually, having pulled out of the EU, we could actually pull out of the European Court of Human Rights and deal with issues around free movement, it's not free movement, of family reunification, etc. Again, EU issues around movement are lost to some extent by being by being court rulings coming from that body.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. The European Court of Human Rights and the European Convention on Human Rights is incredibly important because the Convention does have the right to a family life, and that's why there's just so many people coming to the UK. If they have a cousin, there's also many other cases where if they have a relative here, then they have the right to come here in the way the rules are interpreted. So it's the issue of immigration is not just an EU issue. There's a bigger question out there, but also the WTO also wants to encourage free movement of people because, of course, that does have some input into services. So there's a whole host of other areas where immigration isn't just a European issue. Coming out of the EU doesn't necessarily automatically address many of these problems. It's a bigger topic that needs resolving, and part of that is the way the judges interpret the European Convention on Human Rights.
Yes. Yeah.
Donald Davidson. I believe that Britain formed EFTA in 1958 in response to the setting up of the common market. I believe that's okay. Anyway, the key point is, in terms of the referendum, what happens when the referendum, key issue is the popularity of the government at the time. So what I'm thinking about is when Mitterrand called his referendum on Maastricht in 1992, he just assumed he would walk it. But then I believe, as I said, because basically Mitterrand, the French government is unpopular, that is why the votes in suddenly September, there's a panic, and suddenly it was like the vote was, again, rather suspiciously, like a very like 51, and he's like 50.5% vote in favour. But that's really not because the French were particularly suddenly massively anti-Maastricht. It's because they didn't like Mitterrand's government.
I think that's a glimmer of hope, because whoever calls a referendum, be that Cameron or Miliband or Clegg, they are so awful, really, in my opinion, that they were bound to be unpopular. So whatever they say, the British public probably will go against what they want, because Cameron and Clegg, who actually likes them? Anyone in the audience like Cameron, Clegg, Miliband? No.
Yes, over there, yeah. I'd be very upset to hear that.
You spent the afternoon telling us all about the mountain we have to climb to defeat this monster. But we've got to go away and sell it. And perhaps we ought to have a bit more on the advantages on our side, like starting with one, we are the biggest customer by far. And if they lose their tank customer, Madam Chairman, that will sure shock the markets.
Is anybody? Yes.
Well, yeah, I think that's a very, very good, very valid point to make. And I think I mentioned before that our campaign is about being positive. And I think we ought to stress too that the EU's share of trade, the EU share of our trade is shrinking by the day. And so we shouldn't fight all of this on the EU's ground. And I think we have good reason. Clearly we don't want to be complacent, but I think your point is a very valid one. We have a very strong case to make, and the truth is we can get by without the EU far better than they can get by without us.
Yes. Actually, can we go to Tony Schofield first, and then this gentleman in the front?
Can you hear me? Yes, I'd like to take up John Mills's suggestion about a programme for business, or actually addressing questions to business. Is it working? Business does have its own agenda and point of view. Big business I'm talking about. Now, but they seem to be quite ignorant about other things. For example, if you look at the state of the finances of the EU, you've got one of the advantages of leaving the EU and joining the EEA, or any of the other solutions, is that we would then, Britain as a country, would no longer be jointly and severally liable for all the debts of the EU. Quite a big point, that, in view of the fact that what's happening in the ECB and in the European Investment Bank and all the other, in the accounts of the EU itself. why isn't business worried about these points? Why is it also, why are we not making sure that business is actually directly responsible, for example, for the contributions to the EU budget? We could, for example, abolish corporation tax and say, we'll abolish corporation tax, but you can take charge of making contributions to the EU budget. I bet you'd find their view would change pretty quickly. Because I have never heard a businessman make a pro-EU speech. I've heard plenty of businessmen making pro-single market speeches, but I've ever heard a businessman making a pro-EU speech.
Well, I must say, I think it's an interesting point about the last point you made. But I don't think it's entirely true that, or true at all really, that most businesses are in favour of coming out of the European Union or against the European Union. I mean, the polls suggest by an overwhelming majority that most businesses would like to stay in, provided there are changes in the terms. If the changes in terms are minimal or non-existent, then you get a very different result. As regards the liabilities of businesses to the EU, or indeed the risk that the EU is going to finish up with loads of bad debts, I think there are very substantial risks that there will be defaults all over the place if the Eurozone breaks up. But the commitments that we've got are already there. And even if we came out of the European Union, I very much doubt if, as part of that deal, we would be absolved from responsibility for the commitments which you've already given. So unfortunately, I think we're lumbered up with them.
I think we are. Yes, there's a gentleman at the front here.
Has anyone tried to estimate the number of jobs in other EU countries dependent on their trading with us?
Yeah, it's about 5 million. It's much more than 3 million.
Yes, it's far more than 3 million, yes, far more,
Yeah.
because they're exporting so much more to us.
Chris McGovern, Chairman of the Campaign for Real Education. So obviously everybody here is very knowledgeable about the European Union. Let me just tell you that certainly the last two generations who have been through our education system are not knowledgeable about the European Union. They will not understand the language you're using. I think it was Simon who mentioned Magna Carta. Surveys show that quite a number of young people think Magna Carta was Jimmy Carter's wife. The Prime Minister...
Did she die in vain?
The Prime Minister on American television could not explain the meaning of Magna Carta. He told the American people that in our finest hour, 1940, we were a junior partner to the United States. There is a huge problem of education in the campaign. I mention it because people need to understand these issues very simply, very, very simply. And the younger generations who've gone through school in the last 30 years don't get it at all. They don't understand what you're talking about.
Chris, can I just say, is there a question in there or a more of a statement? I mean, are you anything?
If you've got any solutions to that, the question really is: do you realise this? Yes. And because it's really important.
Yes, yeah.
I think I do, Chris, because I talked to sixth forms as part of the Civitas project, and on the few occasions when this sort of thing has come up, possibly with something to do with the European arrest warrant, and I said, well, of course, we've been doing things differently to this for 800 years. What about Magna Carta? Total blank. In the sixth form. It may vary from school to school, but it's something that I've not ventured towards because there's no common denominator with it. I think there was a time, probably sometime in the late 70s or possibly the early 80s, when that splendid book, 1066 and all that, suddenly was no longer funny to children. And that was probably because they'd not learned. To have a good parody, you've got to have something good to parody, and they were no longer being taught the original.
Did you want to mention that quickly?
Yes.
Yeah.
If I could mention to people, we are producing a booklet about this, which Chris has written for us. It's called Generations Betrayed, Cutting the Roots of National Identity. And it's about the national curriculum for history in schools. It doesn't make comfortable reading, but it does explain why it's very difficult to argue these things about our history and about the development of the way we develop democracy in this country when there's so little knowledge about it.
That was actually the author.
Yes, I say
Yeah,
Chris was
yeah,
the,
yes,
was the author
yes,
of
yeah,
this booklet
yes,
for
fine,
us,
yes.
and Lord Stoddart kindly wrote the foreword.
Yeah. Simon, I think you wanted to come
Yeah,
back on something.
it's an excellent point that Chris has made. Recently we held a Magna Carta debate right opposite Lincoln Cathedral in the Old Bishop's Palace. And the sign there was spelt Magna C-A-R-T-E-R debate. So it is depressing, really. But I would say our own Rupert Matthews, who I mentioned earlier, has written an excellent booklet explaining Magna Carta aimed at secondary school children. It's a little bit like the Horrible Histories books with some nice funny drawings and things, but it is making the serious point in it as well that Magna Carta has been heavily eroded by the European Union. But I think there's a broader point here, if I may, Chris, is that the extent of EU indoctrination of school children and students. There's been huge amounts of money ploughed into propaganda there, and that does make it very difficult for us, and it's something I think we need to have the sort of publicity material that can counter that. It is a really, really serious issue.
Yeah, you wanted to come back.
We have set up a small working group to look into that problem. As I mentioned, I think it's about 7 years now I've been talking to sixth forms about the EU, usually in a debate with somebody from the European movement. And for the first 5 years, it seemed relatively easy, because I had a straight run of winning debates, usually with landslide majorities. About 2 years ago, suddenly got very much harder. And I feel this is probably the work, a result of things that have been done in the primary school levels upwards, because it was far more difficult to shift opinion. And I had the experience of debating with Lib Dem MEP Bill Newton Dunn, and I thought I'd comprehensively answered all his points, but what he'd done was to make the children feel safe and secure in the EU and say, well, the EU's, it's like a family, it's not perfect, but you'd be very lonely and nobody to look after you outside it, and that sort of thing. And that was the line that's being taken.
Yes, thank you. Just wanted to add that the Generations Betrayed, we're going to be giving those out to all of our membership, and if anybody who's not a member of CIB, doesn't want to join, wants to get onto our website, I would think in a week or two you'd be able to purchase them, I would imagine. Yes, a gentleman over there.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Could I ask the panel for their views on how they think the European Union will be impacted by the emergence of Russia, with two particular thoughts I've got in mind. First of all, the European foreign policy seems to have stirred up a hornet's nest in the Ukraine, and the European Union has neither the means nor the will to respond militarily. And secondly, the unravelling of the situation in Greece seems to be opening the door to Russia moving into Greece and probably Cyprus as a result, which has been a long objective of this country, to keep the Russian fleet out of the Mediterranean. And we might have their ships in Piraeus before very long.
To say nothing of the fact that Ukraine, I think yesterday, said it was going to join NATO if it could. It's the first time it's actually said that, isn't it? Yes.
So thank you for that.
Yeah.
I welcome your views.
Put that over to you, and then I'll pass it to the rest of the panel.
Thank you very much, Madam Chairman. Well, there was the potential for good relations between Russia and the European Union in 2011. Russia proposed that they could have a trade agreement between the EU and what's known as the Eurasian Customs Union, which is an agreement with Russia, Belarus and Kazakhstan, which is exactly as I said, a customs union where there is some degree of keeping economic links between those countries. This was rejected by the European Union, who didn't want good relations with Russia. Russia was actually rebuffed by the EU, and they had abandoned close ties and working together. They were set on the idea of incorporating Ukraine into its orbit. A lot of the problems in Ukraine actually arise out of what's known as the proposal to have an association agreement and a deep and comprehensive free trade agreement. course, they're much more than that. They're not just trade agreements between the EU and Ukraine. Prior to those agreements, the EU was bullying Ukraine. It had quotas on its exports, particularly of agricultural products. It was making life very difficult for Ukraine unless it signed up to what the EU wanted. What the EU wanted was not just a trade deal, but it wanted to, which is in the association agreement, wants to have Ukraine subservient to its foreign policy, wants to have Ukraine's armed forces integrated with the European Defence Agency, which will then integrate them in the European Union's member states' armed forces. It has subservience to the EU's common foreign policy. There would be, they'd have to adopt large parts of the acquis communautaire, the body of EU law, and this was seen as very provocative within some sections of Ukraine. Some people in Ukraine wanted to have closer ties with the EU, others didn't. It was a divided country, and they were forced pretty much into making a civilizational choice, which has created a split in that country and a dreadful war, which has led to more than 6,000 deaths and 1 million people having to leave their homes, most of which have taken refuge in Russia to be away from the Ukrainian armed forces. So really the EU it was once about, or sold as being about peace, and it was about reconciliation between France and Germany. They'd witnessed about how after the First World War, Germany being domineered by Western countries had actually just created antipathy. So they tried a new approach, which was to have reconciliation between France and Germany. After the end of the Cold War, there was an opportunity where there could have been reconciliation between the West and Russia, but the West has really, particularly the European Union, has been provocative. It's been rebuffing close ties with Russia. It's alienated them. There's now been this conflict, and really you've got the emergence of what was actually described at a Bruges Group meeting by Bernard Jenkin MP as the emergence of Euro neocons, where a lot of I remember when there was discussions about the Iraq War, Europeans were talked about as being from Venus and wanted peace and didn't want to be involved with these American neocons. But as soon as there's a challenge to EU expansion, then of course the BBC, the Chatham House, all these groups, they become very belligerent. They want more action taken. They want military action taken against anybody that would be against EU expansion, most notably at this point in time, Russia. We see now Europe developing a kind of Euro-nationalism where the European Union is being promoted as not one about a peace project, but as one of we're opposed to the other. We're opposed to policies within Russia. We're opposed to Russian foreign policy. We're opposed to what they want. We're opposed to anything that is not the dominance of Eastern Europe on the European Union's terms. And I think this is a very nasty European Union that's emerging, and it's actually largely led by Chancellor Merkel in Germany, who's the senior partner within the EU. Really, the European Union is no longer a peace project. It's becoming almost, I think, a nationalist project.
Well, I think, to be fair, she did at least seemingly step in to try and stop a war in Europe, which the USA was keen to foment, perhaps. Anyway, I'll give her that. I think Ed would like to come in on that.
Could I say, it's not so long ago that Mr. Cameron was in Kazakhstan saying he looked forward to the day when the European Union stretched from the Atlantic to the Urals.
Yeah, I think we've heard that before.
And somebody else had the same ambition in the early 1940s. NATO, which was a very reliable defensive alliance, changed its character utterly when it launched its unprovoked attack on Yugoslavia in 1999. And just recently, one of the American generals who was involved in that, General Wesley Clark, said that they should be arming the Ukrainians and treating them the same way and training them in the same way that they trained the Croatian forces to break up Yugoslavia. So that is a parallel and a bit of a giveaway. It was General Clark, incidentally, who tried to order General Sir Michael Jackson to attack the Russian forces which had arrived at Pristina Airport in Kosovo, and General Jackson said, "I'm not starting the Third World War for you." So those are the sort of forces that we're up against. And I can feel just a little bit smug about this, although it's a horrible thing to feel smug about. But I think it's 5 or 6 years ago, the video is on the website. I was interviewed by an American journalist, and I prophesied that Russia would reoccupy the Crimea because they were not going to be deprived of their what they call the springboard into the Mediterranean, the naval port at Sevastopol, which they've had for 200 years. They're not going to give it up just because Ukraine has a yen to join the European Union.
No. Yes, Simon.
Whilst I agree with what both Edward and Robert have said on this, and I think Robert's criticisms of the way the EU has handled this are very largely valid, the EU is very expert at turning crises to their own advantage, often crises of their own making. It certainly did this after the September the 11th attack. There was we needed to get together for security. The supposed global warming, they've used that as a reason for more energy policy. You could go on, but I would though have a caveat about. I think it's mistaken to always believe that your enemy's enemy is your friend. And for all the many criticisms, obviously, I have of the European Union, I'm not convinced that Russia is a more pleasant alternative. And the second point is that many
Churchill lived by it. Many conservatives in particular, I think, in the 60s and 70s, supported the European Union, not the common market, the EEC as it was then, not necessarily because they were in favour of European unity as such, but because they felt it helped bolster the free world against the Soviet Empire. When the Soviet Empire collapsed, that threat diminished, and I think that was one of the reasons that criticism of the European Union grew. And I think it is a concern now that with the threat from, and I do think it is a threat from Russia to many of the countries in Central and Eastern Europe, that I've heard people who are genuinely very Eurosceptic in most respects, just sort of roll back a bit. They see the benefits perhaps in staying in the EU. Now, of course, I don't agree with that, but I just think it's something that we need to counter.
Yes, thank you. Any more questions? Yes, gentleman behind you.
Yes, the European arrest warrant was mentioned earlier. Are we not protected by the writ of habeas corpus?
No. Dream on.
No.
Well, it would be nice to think so, but all they've got to do, obviously we've got to produce the body. That's what habeas corpus means, produce the body, which in Tudor days they did, and it was often dead. But we have to produce something live, and that will be produced to court, and then the stipendiary magistrate only has to hear that there is evidence against this person. It might not actually be against the law in this country, but it will have to be in the European arrest warrant, and off they go. In the old days, when I was at Bow Street as clerk to the justices, and I did a lot of extradition, you had to have a prima facie case, which meant there had to be a case to answer on the face of the papers. You don't even have to have that now. So in effect, habeas corpus is only for the courts here. We see the body, it's produced, and then off it goes. And when you get over to the other side of the water, wherever it be, as you know, the limits on how long they can hold you without charge, and often without seeing a proper legally qualified person, are variable and great. So you don't have the same safeguards that you have in this country, and I think it's an abomination. Yes, sorry, who was... I think that gentleman over there, actually. Yeah.
Good afternoon. We are often told that it would be catastrophic now for Greece to leave the euro and the EU. Could the panel explain in sort of economic terms and political terms why it would be catastrophic both for Greece and for the EU and for Britain if they did leave the euro and the EU?
If Greece left?
If Greece, if Greece were to default and to leave the euro, and then we are led to believe that they would have to leave the EU then. Why exactly would that be so catastrophic?
Well, I think there are a lot of repercussions would happen if Greece left. And first of all, if Greece did leave the euro, there'd be a huge devaluation, and this would leave a lot of banks exposed, and there could be very substantial difficulties there. I think probably the European Union could withstand that if you could keep the effect of it all just to Greece. But the real question is whether that's going to be possible, and I must say I'm pretty sceptical but it would be. I mean, first of all, the whole objective of having a single currency was that it was completely irreversible. Once you start having one bit of it that obviously is reversible, then the credibility of the whole concept begins to fall apart. But I think really it issues the contagion issue, that if Greece does leave, and as a result there's a chaotic period for a while, but subsequently the economy very rapidly begins to recover, this seems to me to be likely to present a very, very big challenge to other countries in the single currency, which are at the moment suffering from very severe austerity policies. And for that reason, I think that you would be likely to find that the single currency would begin to crumble. And if that happened, then I think there would be a period of real chaos in Europe, with bankruptcies and bank defaults and all this sort of thing all over the place, before eventually some sort of recovery set in. So I think the prospects actually are very poor for the single currency. Either I think they're going to continue as they are, but with very little growth and high levels of austerity all over the place because of the enormous imbalances there are, or you're going to have a collapse, which I think will then trigger off a subsequent much bigger collapse as other countries gradually domino effect come out. And you'd have a very steep downturn before the recovery set in. And I think this may well have a very big impact over the coming period between now and 2015 and 2020, on what people think of the European Union. I think this is one of the real dynamic factors in the whole situation.
Do you need to add anything to that? Or not? No. You want to? No, I think that's answered that very well, thank you. Now, somebody, I know you've already had a question, so I'll come back to you if there's nobody else. You haven't, have you?
Madam Chair, would the panel agree that the government's decision to opt into the European arrest warrant, which gives EU prosecutors the right to arrest and incarcerate Britons without any prima facie evidence, is a surrender of major powers to the EU, which should have been protected by Mr Cameron's triple lock of a referendum on the surrender of further powers?
Mm. Well, it'd be nice to think so, but I think technically it wasn't, was it? Because it's already, was it not already on the books, and we opted into bits and opted out of other bits?
Well, we took the decision to opt into other measures as well, such as the European Investigation Order, which means that foreign police forces within the European Union can find out information about you should they request it, and it has to be supplied in 2010. The referendum lock was, of course, lauded as stopping European centralisation. It does nothing of the sort. It would only apply on a matter that they deem to be of importance. So really, I think it was a fig leaf to hide their pro-EU intentions, because the government, apart from various elements within that government, do largely remain wedded to the idea of Britain staying in the European Union and signing up to many of these things, such as the European arrest warrant and the European Investigation Order and 32 other measures, all to do with justice and home affairs that should be the preserve of a nation state, but have been handed away by this government. So it's in that sense not much different to the previous government that had gone before.
I think the problem was, as far as I understood it, that so much had already gone on under the justice business, you know, that's what they want, harmony and justice, allegedly, that it was just part and parcel of what had gone before. Had it been something wholly new, I think you would have been right. But as ever, they always manage to muddle everybody so much by opting in and then opting out and then thinking about it, and then you wonder what on earth's happened.
Madam Chairman, Eurosceptic groups, all of them, it seems to me, have failed in one very important respect, and that is to separate out in the public's mind being a member of the EU and trading with the EU. And whenever leaving the EU is mentioned, there is always a cacophony in the press, from business, wherever it is. Oh, we'll lose jobs. Oh, we'll lose trade, and so on. And we have simply failed to get across this point that we can leave the EU, but stay in the single market. And although that is not a perfect solution, it is an off-the-shelf solution which works, and it knocks this argument about trade on the head. It simply removes it. We could leave the EU, leave behind justice, home affairs, agriculture, fisheries, and all that stuff, and still continue trading.
Point taken, yes. This is obviously, what Robert was talking to us about today, and I agree with you entirely that that is the central message that must be got over. And once that's got over, a lot of people will say, gosh, well, why weren't we told that? Because it's deliberately muddled.
But we don't need to be in the single market at all to trade with Europe. And I mean, if you look at what's happening, you've got loads, and China is a much bigger trade partner for the European Union than we are, and so is the United States. Neither of them are involved in any way in terms of political integration. The total tariffs on average with trade between us and the European Union are very low now, something like 2%. I know there are some peaks with motor vehicles and one or two other things, chemicals and so on. But because we've got an adverse trade balance with all these people, the chances of these tariffs actually coming into force actually are really very low. So I think the notion that we've just got to stay in the single market, come what may, is one which actually is not nearly as strong as most people make it out to be. But I agree with you that it is difficult to get that message across to the public.
May I just briefly commend a recent publication called The Scaremongers, which a group called Global Britain has recently published, and that handles this well. And one thing, I think it emphasises how actually all these different groups, not just the ones sitting on this platform, represented on this platform now, we all get on surprisingly well together. But I agree with your point, but I do recommend people reading The Scaremongers.
You do want to come back on that?
Well, we do need to knock that argument on the head that leaving the EU would damage trade. It is still used against us. And of course, we do actually absolutely, as you said, separate the trade issue from the membership of the EU, because they often are used to confuse the two by Europhiles, trying to sell our membership of what is in reality a political union on the grounds of trade. And then once we do that, once we're successful in that task, then we can focus on how getting out of the EU would be getting us out of the joint and severally liable debts of the European Union and the risks of the euro area that could come back on Britain, the risks that Britain faces as a member of the EU via the European Investment Bank. We can focus then on the arguments about democracy, on civil liberties, as was discussed, getting out of these justice and home affairs measures that threaten our rights, such as the European arrest warrant. We can focus on British independence and sovereignty, and how the EU is declining globally and the rest of the world is expanding. And in 1975, of course, John Mills was the agent for the Come Out the EU campaign. They had the brilliant slogan, "Out of the EU, into the world." That was what was used in 1975. I think we can use that again, and it's even more pertinent today and will be successful. But first of all, we really do have to separate this whole issue of EU membership and trade in the public's mind, and then we can focus on our territory and on those points I mentioned, and we can win.
Can I just add quickly to that in fact the CIB have discussed this matter, and we were hoping to do a joint venture of a film on that particular topic, but we haven't heard back from them as yet, but we will get in touch with Global Britain again. Yes, time for one more question. You've had one already. Is there anybody who hasn't asked a question who'd like to ask one? Right, the lady there.
Ladies last. Yes, I have been quite recently converted to Robert's idea of rejoining EFTA. That really seems to be the obvious way to win the battle of the referendum, should we have one. But how does anyone in the panel believe it's possible to have that incorporated into the wording of the referendum? Because how else do we get that in front of the public's ears so that they know that that is then an alternative option to EU membership?
Well, in my opinion, we just need to be talking about it a lot and making sure people realise that it's not about leaving something, it's about joining something better, replacing what hasn't been working for Britain, what has a whole host of risks, with something that is actually making people a lot better off. EFTA countries have lower unemployment, higher GDP per capita, higher FDI, foreign direct investment per capita. They're doing a lot better off. They export per capita more to the single market than the UK does in the EU. So really we just need to explain to people that the choice is, when we vote to come out, there's a clear alternative. Because at the moment we are faced with the problem is that the alternative hasn't been properly defined, it hasn't been properly explained as yet, because I think too much focus is still going on to this bogus argument about renegotiation and reform of the EU. We need to be talking about the alternatives, getting that out and showing that voting to come out is for something positive and something better, and the public will then be clear what it's about.
I was going to say, Daphne, it's highly unlikely we'll ever get in there, because the Tories, if there is a referendum, will be in charge of it, and the last thing they want to do is tell people about EFTA. They'll be still frightening everybody, so I doubt it'll get put in. So I agree that the only thing to do is try and get the message out beforehand. Because yes, that's right. Anybody?
Well, the only thing I would say is that there's no guarantee that we would be able to join EFTA. We'd have to get the agreement of the other people in EFTA, which I'm not saying wouldn't be forthcoming. It may well be. But this does open up the possibility for anybody opposing us in a referendum, saying, look, there's no certainty about this. You may suddenly find that you've severed your links with the European Union, but you haven't got anything else to put in place.
Well, what about the EEA, though? I mean, we could just
the EEA, the problem with the EEA is that it leaves you then with a lot of obligations on the free movement of labour, plus all the other elements of the single market, which a lot of people complain about. And I think you then open yourself up to the charge and say, well, why do you want to bother with all this anyway? If you're going to stay in the EEA with the single market and you're going to go on having lots of immigration, why do you want to change everything? So I think these are quite complicated issues which really need more study. I think we've got to be very careful that we don't come down too strongly on one option before we've really made sure that we've got a cast-iron case for what we're advocating.
It would stop Mr. Miliband going around saying that the two are the same, though. You know, once we leave the EU, that's it. We're out of the single market.
Well,
which he knows isn't correct. But
I mean, the answer is that we would be, unless you can get some other arrangement in place. Now, you can either do that by negotiating directly with the European Union, or you can do it through EFTA. And I'm not saying that there aren't substantial advantages for joining EFTA. I think that John's argument, you don't have to be in the EAA to join EFTA.
Oh, no.
So I mean, there is an important distinction there, and it may be that that would be the best outcome. All I'm really saying is that I think that there are some very complex issues, again, around the, whether you have a customs union or a free trade area, which need, I think the more unity we can get in what we're really advocating on all this, frankly, the better.
Yes, there is that. Yes, anything you'd like to say, Simon? Or?
No, I just very strongly agree with what John said.
Well, I think we said we'd stop at 5, and here we are at 5. So I think we've done quite well, and I hope you'll agree it's been a very interesting afternoon, and thank you very much for attending.